Welcome to the Russell Moore Show. Every week we do an audio version of my newsletter, More to the Point, which you can subscribe to get in your inbox every Wednesday in the show notes. Just click the link there and it's free. Not long ago, a Christian economist from India was talking to a group of us, saying that he was part of an unusual coalition. It ranged from atheists to believers, from astronomers and physicists to religious leaders. They were all trying to do the same thing, to debunk astrology in their home country of India. Now, this was not some remnant of old Eastern superstitions, as some Western secularists would assume. The hunger for horoscopes there in India, he said, was largely a cultural import from North America. I don't think this should surprise us. In her book of several years ago, Strange Rites, New Religions for a Godless World, Tara Isabella Burton points to studies showing that 40% of those who say they have no religious affiliation, the so-called nuns, believe in psychics, and 32% say they believe in astrology. Burton argues that secularization does not mean an abandonment of spiritual beliefs and practices, but a remixing of them. We can see some of the fascination with the role of the stars, with astrology and horoscopes, in recent fictional explorations of the question of the meaning of life. Carl Nosberg's 2020 novel, The Morning Star, talks about a series of family conflicts and personal crises in the context of a mysterious, foreboding star in the night sky. A similar story is in the background of Sarah Perry's 2024 novel, Enlightenment, which is about, of all things, an English Calvinistic Baptist whose faith is deconstructing. And he's questioning whether a comet that's in the sky is controlling his fate. He says he found purpose in a combination of physics and a kind of astrology. When Perry was talking to interviewers about her book, she said that her editors insisted that she explain in plainer terms for readers theological concepts that she talks about in the book, such as predestination and providence. One assumes that the editors took for granted that readers would need little explanation for the kind of fatalism that is grounded in reading the stars. Now, astrology is an ancient practice, but it is perfectly fitted for this age. In his Confessions, Augustine argued that astrology was a way to justify one's sin without the search for mercy from God. The astrologers could say, the cause of your sinning was fixed unchangeably by the heavens, and the planet Venus or Saturn or Mars has done this, Augustine said, meaning that man, made up of flesh and blood and proud corruption, is free from fault, and that the creator and ruler of the sky and the stars must bear the blame. Now, Augustine was right. Humanity does indeed always wish to self-justify our own guilt. But I think there's an added pull to astrology that's different from that of more ancient times. We have choices now every day that our ancestors never imagined. Up until very, very recently, a high school career counselor, the very idea would have made no sense to anyone. In some ways, the same was true of other big choices, who a person would marry, for instance, or where someone would live. But that is, making those decisions is fraught with the possibilities of making the wrong choice. Why should you trust your 19 or 20-year-old self in the past to make decisions that will define not just your life for the rest of your life, but rippling generations after you? Pierce Moffat, a character in John Crowley's Egypt series of novels, realizes that the clairvoyance and astrology ideas are really about, as he puts it, assenting that the cosmos was in some sense a story, that the universe was a cosmos. The search for harmonies and directions for the future, he writes, ultimately is about providing for people Cliff's notes to the plots of their own lives. When faced with the fear of wrecking one's future, or the regret of fearing that one has already done so, who wouldn't want a Cliff's Notes, a shorthand way to find that plot line? That is especially true when an entire global culture seems plagued by the kind of anxiety that philosopher Hartmut Rosa describes as the simultaneously expectation of being in control of everything while feeling that everything is out of control. When a person feels dominated by a fate outside one's control, there's a kind of comfort found in seeing that the fate controlled by our zodiac sign, not by our decisions. And that's one of the reasons I think we can reassure ourselves. At least we can see what's coming. The wise men of the birth narrative of the Gospel of Matthew were Eastern star readers, discerning from a sign in a recently appearing disturbance in the night sky, a sign of the inheritor of the prophecies of the coming king of Israel. Matthew writes in Matthew 2. The star did indeed lead them to the place of the Christ child. And when they calculated by the star the location of this child, Matthew tells us that they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy and worshiped Jesus when they found him. Matthew 2:11. At first glance, the guidance of the Magi might lead us to conclude that we too should seek out those who can read the constellations. But the story of Jesus upends all of that. The ancient prophecy, I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. A star shall come out of Jacob, and a scepter shall rise out of Israel. Numbers 24:17. Also originated with a frustrated occultist. Balaam was hired by the warlord Balak to place a curse on Israel, a curse that God kept turning into a blessing that would include that prophecy of Jacob's dawning star. The Apostle Paul wrote little about what we call the Christmas story, with the exception of such brief references as this one. But when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his son, born of woman, born under the law. Galatians 4:4. This one, born of the woman, Paul said, would free us from slavery, slavery to the law, but also to what he called in Galatians 4:3, the elementary principles of the world. The pull, Paul wrote to the church at Colossae, was to return to the captivity according to those elemental spirits of the world. Colossians 2:8. The ancients weren't stupid to believe themselves to be trapped by some kind of fate, by forces outside of their control. After all, the elements of the universe ultimately kill us all. The problem is not that people feel this kind of fatalism. The problem is that we actually want it. Paul writes in Galatians 4:9, formerly, when you did not know God, you were enslaved to those that by nature are not God's. But now that you have come to know God, or rather to be known by God, how can you return back again to the weak and worthless elementary principles of the world, whose slaves you want to be once more? Galatians 4:9. Whose slaves you want to be once more. Paul says that we want slavery to the elemental forces of the world. Whether it's with a well, what are you going to do? Kind of resignation, or with some attempt to channel those cosmic forces that we believe are throwing us around out of our control. Left to ourselves, we would rather have a story written for us by fate or destiny or charts or graphs or even a legal code from the Bible than to contemplate the dark possibility that there's no story at all, just a random, meaningless void. Now, there's a certain kind of rationalist that laughs at superstition and backwardness of those who read their horoscopes. But there's not really that big a difference between that kind of superstition and the kind of techno utopianism that rests the future on technological mastery, say, of terraforming Mars or downloading human consciousness to the cloud in order to evade death. We don't find freedom from that kind of fate slavery, though, by mastering the elements, or even worse, by trying to master the creator of the elements. We don't find it by becoming as smart as the universe, or by learning how to harness the universe, either by magic or technology. We find freedom instead, Paul writes in that passage to the Galatians, as children and heirs of the Father who, as he puts it in Galatians 4:6, sent the Spirit of his Son into our hearts, crying, Abba, Father. In other words, we find freedom not by becoming magi. And we certainly don't find freedom by becoming like King Herod, attempting to channel the power that they have in knowledge to protect himself and his own throne. We find freedom when we're joined in union with Christ and we cry out in dependence. The Spirit of his Son cries out in us, Paul writes, not on an impersonal universe, but to a Father who loves us. By losing your need for control, even the illusory kind of control, pretend control of predicting your future, you can count the future of Jesus as your future, his destiny, if you will, as your own destiny. By losing your life, you can find it. So maybe the star on top of every Christmas tree you see this year will remind you every day that you see it that it really can't help you as you grapple with a past you might regret or a future you might fear. The person checking the horoscope app next to you in the coffee shop is not a flake or a fool. He or she is trying to find a story that makes sense. That way won't get them there. But God has been known to redirect people to the real story, the story that became flesh and dwelled among us, full of grace and truth. This is Russell Moore. See you next time.